New York, I'm Chris Hayes. With me this morning, I have Jeffrey Toobin, author of The Oath, the Obama White House and the Supreme Court, Barbara Arnwine from the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under the Law, Yale Law Professor Akhil Amar, and Elise Badi from the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. We are talking about the Supreme Court, which will be hearing oral arguments for the first day of the term tomorrow, and there is a lot that is on its docket or will be on its docket, we are assuming. We just talked about affirmative action, whether that, what its fate will be. An even bigger issue, particularly in the context of what has been going on in this election, with outright attempts at, in my humble opinion, voter suppression being pushed at the state level, restrictions put on who can vote that clearly have a disproportionate impact, if not the intent to disenfranchise certain minority groups, but have that disproportionate impact. The Voting Rights Act, signature piece of American legislation, famous, obviously, a huge, towering achievement of the Civil Rights Movement, signed in 1965 LBJ, extended for 25 years in 2006 by the Congress. Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act requires that certain states with a history of discrimination and barring voting, largely in the states of the old Confederacy, but also other districts in other places, the Bronx, I think, and Brooklyn are actually covered districts under Section 5, have preclearance. And preclearance means you can't go about changing the way that you are going to redistrict or go about changing voting rules without going to the Department of Justice first and saying, is this okay? Because the history of these jurisdictions is using those mechanisms explicitly to disenfranchise people. There's a long, gruesome history of that since the days of Reconstruction. Okay, that's what's on the table, right?
Yes.
The state of Alabama is brought a facial challenge to the Section 5 saying, this is ridiculous, times have changed, stop it. The state of Texas went around the preclearance process, said, we're redistricting the way that we want, we're not going to go through preclearance. It came before a panel in the federal in District of Columbia. It was struck down 2-1. So the court has not said that they're going to hear the Voting Rights Act, but it looks very likely, I think, right, is the general prevailing wisdom. They are. And let me just say, in 2009, they had a case before them, the Voting Rights Act, that they basically punted on. They basically said, we're not going to find whether the Voting Rights Act is still should be enforced. But here's what John Roberts said in the plurality opinion in that. Things have changed in the South. Voter turnout and registration rates now approach parity. Blatantly discriminatory evasions of federal decrees are rare. And minority candidates hold office at unprecedented levels. Indicating that, the time for all this heavy-handed telling Georgia what it could do is over. This would be pretty big if they took the Voting Rights Act, Section 5. Barbara?
Well, the first thing that we have to think about is that the Texas redistricting case, the court has to do something with that case. It either has to, accept it and review it, or it has to summarily affirm or reverse. So that is the first case that's really before them. And then you have the Shelby County case, which is the Namudo 2, as they say, which is, once again, the question of the constitutionality of Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. So this question comes in two ways before the court. Well, the question is, what are they going to do? I think that it's very important for people to know that this is not history, past history we're talking about. That in 2006, the record that we, the civil rights organizations, the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, and others helped to put before the Congress showed that between 1980 and today, that there has been over 423 objections by the Department of Justice because of purposeful discrimination. This is not accidental, disparate impact, effect, purposeful discrimination. So we are living in an age where even though the Voting Rights Act has been transformative to our nation, it's still, people are still doing everything they can to dilute, to take away the power of the black and the Latino vote.
Yeah. But doesn't Roberts have something of a point when he says the South, the South has changed, and also doesn't he have I mean, you're so concerned about voter suppression, understandably, but where's that taking place? Ohio, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, all these states that went Republican in 2010.
But here's the problem.
But what isn't the rest of the country just as racist and just as discriminating as the South?
Here's my response to that. I think Crawford, which is the Supreme Court case, which actually Justice Stevens signed on to the majority opinion, which allowed voter ID in Indiana was a bad decision. So I actually think, and hell, let's extend. I actually think the Voting Rights Act gets it right. I think the Voting Rights Act should be applied everywhere, which is disparate impact should be the test.
But that's fine. But that's not what the Voting Rights Act says.
No, I know that.
Voting rights.
Right, that's my personal Voting Rights Act.
Yeah, so here's the point. Your observation about the past. It's the William Faulkner saying the past is not dead. It's not even past.
It's prolonged.
I think so. Here's the deal. Shelby County, Alabama. There's a cert petition to the Supreme Court. In our view, not clear that the court should take the case because the court has affirmed this provision of the Voting Rights Act 4 times. There was a very substantial record, 16,000 pages before Congress when it reauthorized the Voting Rights Act. This provision in 2006. But here's the key. Again, Justice Kennedy is the swing vote here. There's always been a gap in coverage. As it turns out, the state of Texas wasn't covered by the initial 1965 Act. It was added in 1975. That's always been the case. The question here is, are we going to defer to the judgment of Congress that this act is still necessary? Is Congress's judgment reasonable?
But the argument, but respond to Jeff's argument, which is to say that the way the strangeness of the Voting Rights Act, right, is the strangeness of American politics, which is the strangeness of slavery, the Civil War, Reconstruction, and everything else, which is that there's one region of the country that and different specific geographic regions where we have a certain process for, and other regions we have another process for. And the argument that Jeff's making is, hey, look at those regions we don't have this special process for. They seem to be doing the same stuff. What is the justification for treating them different?
Well, there's been a particularly pernicious history in the covered jurisdictions, and that was the judgment of Congress. And so, therefore, are we going to second guess Congress's legislative judgment about the need for this provision going forward?
Well, in the Shelby County case, the court actually found, the circuit court, that when you looked at the Section 2, enforcement in particular, that over 50% of all those cases came from the South still. I mean, so you got to really look at where is this active discrimination the worst? Because think about it, 57% of all African Americans live in the South.
Right.
The Latino population is growing rapidly in the South. So is the Asian American population. So these are, really great issues, and that history cannot be just discarded.
Let me just note that Florida is one place where they have where the Venn diagram, right? They have pushed it, and that is a covered district, and actually the federal court has struck it down under the Voting Rights Act. Akil, I want to get your thoughts on this right after we take a quick break.
Awesome.
We're discussing the fate of the Voting Rights Act, which many observers feel will come before the court in its term, which begins tomorrow. Akil, you had something you want to say?
That this landmark congressional statute coming out of the second Reconstruction in the 1960s is, of course, an echo of the original Reconstruction, in which some states were singled out for separate treatment. In fact, they weren't allowed back into Congress unless they promised to vote for the 14th Amendment.
Under arms. With armies occupying.
So this actually, there is a history here, and it goes all the way back. Now, one argument is, but that's all long ago. If a jurisdiction has kept its nose clean and hasn't actually violated voting rights recently, it can actually bail out. And if some jurisdictions that haven't been covered have bad recent histories, they actually get thrown in. And so, but
that's interesting. So this is actually based on it's not locked in.
Exactly.
It isn't at all. And this is, in a way, the perfect storm. We talked about the Obamacare case. What was that about? Deference to Congress or not, and this actually is in the Constitution, Section 5, not of the statute, but of the 14th Amendment. It says Congress shall have power to enforce this. So it's about deferring to Congress. And on the other side, this states' rights argument, and the claim here is this isn't fair to states. What else did we talk about? We talked about Texas affirmative action. One objection to the Voting Rights Act is, in order to avoid a finding that you've actually discriminated against minorities, sometimes jurisdictions might have to take race into account by always have to do a certain kind of racial affirmative action, and that's what gets some conservatives upset about this. So this is kind of a perfect storm, in a way,
of these different
affirmative
lines.
action, deferring to Congress, states' rights.
And can I jump in here to Akhil's point? I mean, it's interesting. We have this powerful narrative in this country that progress is inevitable. With the march of time, things will always get better. And with respect to race, I think what we see is that progress is more episodic. It's more fitful. We have significant progress marked by retrenchment, which we're seeing in the wake of the 2008 elections. And so Section 5 sits in that space, right? It recognizes that we have a past of historical discrimination and that Congress made a predictive judgment that problem is likely to continue, which is why the covered jurisdictions need to seek preclearance before changing. The separate point that I want to make is that, this coverage gap issue, where some states are protected and some aren't, I find it deeply ironic because if you look at the jurisprudence, the Supreme Court's jurisprudence on race, the core fundamental premise that it rests on is that intervention, race-conscious intervention, should be targeted, should be narrow. And so we should only focus on areas that have the most pernicious problems. Right. And that's what Section 5 does. The reauthorization did in 2006. It's focused on the states with the most difficult history.
And that's the beauty of the Section 5 of the VRA, is that it really, when Congress reauthorized it, they made one important statement to everybody in this country. They said the right to vote is critical, that this is fundamental to being an American, that it should be protected.
Not according to Justice Scalia.
That we should not, allow this fundamental right to be infringed upon, just repeatedly, that these jurisdictions have to learn to be truly, American and fair to all of their citizens.
One of the things also, if you're looking about the history, but going forward, is what's happening. One of the concerns now is that in the South, as the white Democrat essentially dies off, Barack Obama got 10% of the white vote in Alabama, I want to say, 11% in Mississippi, right? That as of the 2010 midterms, you have this situation now where you have majority Republican state houses that are all white, more or less, and then minority Democratic state houses that are majority black in many cases, and this fear that you're going to have essentially this permanent kind of racial majority-minority politics in the South.
I just had an interesting conversation with Jason Carter, who was a state senator in Georgia, who Jimmy Carter's grandson, young, the 36-year-old state senator, and he was saying, I'm for the Voting Rights Act. I'm a Democrat. I love the Voting Rights Act. But one of the problems is it has encouraged exclusively minority district. Right. I want to have an integrated district. Right. I want to have a district where I appeal to both white voters and black voters. And especially in the earlier days of the Voting Rights Act, there was sort of what was sometimes called the unholy alliance between African-American politicians and white Republican legislatures.
To concentrate.
Which was they basically throw all the African-Americans into one district. It'll be represented by a Democratic African-American forever.
Right.
And then everything else will be white and Republican. That's a problem.
But I always say to that argument, well, then why don't you have the governors? Why do you lose these statewide offices? That has nothing to do with any redistricting. It has nothing to do with the Voting Rights Act. The fact is that the Democrats have been losing for different reasons. And I don't want to get into all those reasons why they're not, popular with white Americans in general. But
in the South.
In the South.
Yeah.
And so that's because I just want to point out that it's not all the loss has anything to do with redistricting.
But it's also important to recognize, for all the reasons that we've been discussing, that, it matters for African Americans to have the opportunity to elect candidates of their choice.
Absolutely.
We've certainly seen the rise of influence districts, but it's important for there to be African American and Latino representation in the halls of power.
And that's been one of the principles of the Voting Rights Act. Barbara Arnwine from the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights under the law. Elise Body from the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. Great discussion. Thank you so much for joining us. Should we accept insult as an exercise of free speech? Journalist Mona El-Tahawy, who was arrested for spray painting an offensive ad, joins us next. President Obama had to perform a balancing act of sorts while speaking to the United Nations General Assembly on Tuesday. He wanted to appeal to both a domestic audience that wants its president to advocate forthrightly for American values, while also showing respect to leaders and citizens of nations in the Muslim world angered by an American anti-Muslim film clip posted on YouTube. all while trying to quell some of the criticism from Mitt Romney and other Republicans that he's looked weak on foreign policy. So, in his last big speech on a global stage before the November election, President Obama said this.
As president of our country and commander-in-chief of our military, I accept that people are going to call me awful things every day. And I will always defend their right to do so. We do so because in a diverse society, efforts to restrict speech can quickly become a tool to silence critics and oppress minorities. We do so because, given the power of faith in our lives and the passion that religious differences can inflame, the strongest weapon against hateful speech is not repression. It is more speech. The voices of tolerance that rally against bigotry and blasphemy and lift up the values of understanding and mutual respect.
Meanwhile, we've seen another controversy erupt over offensive speech. Inside subway terminals not too far up the United Nations building here in New York, the MTA is running this ad. It reads, "In any war between the civilized man and the savage, support the civilized man, support Israel, defeat jihad." The ads come from Pamela Geller, executive director of the American Freedom Defense Initiative. Geller is the co-founder of an organization called Stop Islamization of America, with a long history of anti-Muslim paranoia and scaremongering. The MTA rejected the ads initially, then Geller sued and won a federal court ruling on First Amendment grounds. The ad went up last week in 10 subway stations. On Thursday, the MTA approved new guidelines for ads, which will include a disclaimer implying that the MTA does not endorse such views. Right now, I'm joined by Mona El-Tahawi, an Egyptian-American journalist who was arrested Tuesday for spray painting one of the ads. Mona, it's good to have you. First time at the table. You've been on the program before from Cairo, but it's wonderful to have you here.
Thanks for having me, Chris.
Okay, let's show this video of what happened. You went out as an act of dissent, civil disobedience, with pink spray paint canister, and this is what transpired. There was a New York Post reporter who was camped out around the ads, I think, to catch whatever might happen, as well as an associate ally of Pam Geller. Take a look.
Tell me, Mona, what right do you have to violate free speech?
I'm not violating it. I'm making an expression on free speech.
No,
if you don't want anything yourself, you should get out of my way.
You do not have a right.
I do, actually, and I'm doing it right now.
You have a lot of nerve,
Oh, yeah. No, I don't have nerve. You know what I have? I have an understanding of racism.
You are violating free speech, Mona.
I'm not. It's clear. I'm not violating.
Free speech.
I am expressing myself freely against hate and racism.
This was an approved ad, Mona.
I really don't care. I need to know what you're arresting me for. It's my right to know what you're arresting me for.
All right, you were arrested. You spent a little time in a holding cell. All right, there's a few things we got to talk about here. This is sort of the principle of free speech, tolerance, incitement, all those things. But first, can we just talk tactics? I mean, here's my deal with this incident. There's a great internet phrase called "don't feed the trolls." Mm-hmm. And this is great wisdom that I try to take in my life, which is when someone tries to basically get a rise out of you with idiocy, just don't rise to the bait. And this seemed to me like this was like an exercise in feeding the trolls. So why did you decide to do this?
Well, first of all, because this ad is more than idiocy. This ad wasn't like, that film, that was idiocy. It was this film that no one had seen on YouTube until someone pulled it out. But this is an ad that is seen by the millions of people who ride the subway, including myself, every day in New York. This is an ad that comes 11 years into Muslims and Arabs, because this isn't just about Islam here. There is racism and bigotry involved. 11 years after 9/11, a horrendous terrorist attack that no Muslim I know has ever condoned. And 11 years after the Muslim and Arab citizens of New York, the New Yorkers here, constantly being called upon to apologize over and over again for something that we didn't do. And again, this is an ad that conflates being Arab and Muslim with being against Israel and being with jihad. This choice is a forced choice. So it's more than idiocy.
Okay, okay, stipulate all of that, agree with all of that. But then it's like, not to get too meta, but like you went and spray painted it, so now I'm showing the ad on my television show. So what's the statement there? Like when you say I'm not like, is this an act of civil disobedience? You recognize that, okay, I am violating some law in, like, spray painting it, and I want to make some statement?
Yeah, I'm standing up to racism and hate, as I was saying in the video constantly. I don't think we should be quiet or silent or be bullied into silence in the face of racism and hate. And this country, I'm a U.S. citizen, and this country has a long and proud history of civil disobedience. I was prepared to be arrested. I wrote to many of my friends and said, look, I might be arrested, so if I go offline for a few hours, be prepared. I was arrested. I'm proud I was arrested. I would do it again in a second, because we should not be bullied into silence by racism. And Pamela Geller is a known bigot and racist who has a lot of money and who thinks that her money can silence us. This isn't the first time an ad has been defaced.
How is she silencing you by putting an ad on a bus?
No, this is an ad in the subway.
Subway.
Well, because now someone like Chris is saying, well, why did you just feed the trolls? This ad has to be responded to. I believe this ad must be responded to.
She didn't silence you.
The attempts to tell me that you're doing it as a publicity stunt was people telling me.
Well, no,
you
I'm
should
having
be silent
a show.
to it.
I'm not trying to silence you. I want to hear from you. That's why you're sitting here.
Okay, fine. Your point. Okay, you make a legitimate point. What she's doing then is bullying, not silencing.
Okay.
The silencing is coming from other corners, and I refuse to be bullied.
Okay.
That's my point.
So there's one alternative, which is just ignore the troll. But there's another possibility, too, which is a counter speech that doesn't deface private property, but takes that ad, creates, photoshops it, creates your own spoof
and
of
other
it,
people
putting
have done that
on the internet. And that's what President Obama was calling for when he said more speech.
Right.
And that was another alternative.
I want to ask about.
That's a great point, and I acknowledge your point. But as I was telling you on the video as well, look, 2 hours before I did what I did, I saw a man on 49th Street, the NQR, actually rip a poster and say, this is beep, New York City, this is unacceptable.
Right.
I did not want to rip that poster. You know what I wanted to do? I wanted to write racist in pink, because pink is the least non-violent color there is, but I'm not good at tagging, okay? I clearly need graffiti lessons, okay? But I chose pink for many reasons, one of which is it does not actually remove the words. I did not want to remove the words. I could have chosen black.
I want to talk about the innocence of Muslims was the other big provocation, and what kind of free speech and incitement and where those two might rub up against each other right after this break. So we're all dealing with the fallout from these protests that happened across much of I would say the Muslim world, not just the Middle East and Arab world, right? But they also happened in Bangladesh and Pakistan and some in Indonesia, about this film that was uploaded to YouTube, which is a ridiculous enterprise. What was your sense of, what was your reaction to what happened in Egypt, which is where you spend a lot of your time, in reaction to this?
Well, I was there when it actually all started outside the US Embassy on the 9/11 anniversary. My position all along has been that it was a right wing provoking a right wing, which is again why I did what I did in the subway, because clearly I'm not the right wing, even though the right wing calls me an anti-speech Islamo-Nazi. But that's another thing. So the way I saw it is that Egypt is going through a lot of change right now, and we have an extreme right wing, the Salafists, who initiated these demonstrations because they're panicking. They're clearly panicking because they don't know where they fit into Egypt as it moves on. And you have a right wing here in this country, which is clearly also on the lunatic fringe of the right, which is also panicking because this country is also changing, and we have an election coming. So you're talking about two right wings addressing each other, both of them pissing each other off, and we're stuck in the middle. And my position all along was that this is like a dying cry of the right wing. I fully believe in the right to offend. I don't believe anyone should be protected from offense. But I believe that I also have a right to peacefully protest that offense. That's what I did.
So what do you think? Yeah, Jeff.
Well, I mean, it's not just the right wing that is angry at what's going on in the Islamic world. That is the extremist part of the Islamic movement. I mean, I guess I'm just a little. There's a little equivalence in what you're saying that seems a little false to me. I mean, the fact that people were attacking the embassy, and going back to the Danish cartoons about Muhammad, where people died in those riots. I mean, that's not just the right wing that is upset about that. That is our whole. I mean, I would think across our political spectrum that is horrified by that.
It was a right wing. Oh, you mean here in this country or in Egypt? But I'm talking about who initiated these protests. The protests were initiated in
Egyptian politics.
And also across various Muslim countries. It was a right wing there. And then the man who made this film in this country also belongs to a right wing that wants to provoke. Now, you're talking about the great majority here who are horrified, of course, at the acts of violence, and at least 14 people were killed during those weeks that I was in Cairo. But at the same time, you have a large population in the so-called Islamic world that is very angry with the United States for the invasion of Iraq, the war in Afghanistan, the drone attacks, for so many things. So you're talking about a lot of political anger that was manipulated into offense and used to get people onto the street.
Mohamed Morsi, who is I guess he's the president of Egypt. That's the term being used. Yes. President of Egypt, duly elected in the first election since the fall of Mubarak and the revolution, has been proposing some kinds of blasphemy laws, and these blasphemy laws now are very popular among some of the new post-revolutionary governments. In Tunisia, they're being considered. There were proposals in front of the UN General Assembly that basically, you can't do certain things, certain kinds of speech, that are derogatory to the Prophet Muhammad, for instance. What's your feeling about a law like that in Egypt?
I'm horrified. I absolutely reject. I mean, this is why, again, I said I believe in the right to offend. Blasphemy laws across the world, whether you look at Pakistan or any other country, but especially Pakistan, because it comes up there a lot, are often used as political tools against opponents and minorities of any kind. So I absolutely reject. That's why I was telling the woman in the video, I'm using speech. But I want to discuss what is protected speech? If you have the right to be racist and bigoted, what right, where does my right then end to respond to your racism and bigotry? But I don't want a blasphemy law that's going to silence, again, minorities and people that don't agree with the government.
One of the arguments I've heard, interestingly, in the fallout from this, right, is that our conception of free speech as embodying the First Amendment and First Amendment jurisprudence, particularly in the last 30 or 40 years, because there's a lot of First Amendment jurisprudence before that, during periods of communist scares, that was pretty tolerant, right, of some fairly severe limitations. You hear people, and I heard a great NPR report of just talking to folks in Tunisia that said, look, in Europe, they say you can't deny the Holocaust. And, there's all kinds of restrictions. Why can't we, our democratically elected government, draw these red lines?
And you heard earlier from President Obama a wonderful defense of American-style democracy, American exceptionalism, if you will, because democracy isn't just about voting. It's not one person, one vote, one time. It's a culture that it has to involve free speech, part of which will be the right to voice opinions that other folks won't like, and a thought that the government should not be in the business of suppressing opinion. And you heard that very emphatically from a constitutional law professor, American exceptionalism, because we have the most robust tradition of free speech, saying if you don't like it, speak up against it, but don't have the government repress it. And here's the most amazing thing. Even before we had the First Amendment, I just got to work in that this month is the 225th anniversary of the year when the Constitution actually was presented to the people. This audacious continental-wide vote, but not just vote, but an amazing free speech experience. For 1 year, up and down a continent, the most raucous, wide open, robust, uninhibited free speech, burnings in effigy, pretty intense opinions. No one dies in the whole year. You compare that to the French Revolution or the American Revolution. Raucous free speech, pro really and against, and that is the tradition that Barack Obama, I think, wonderfully defended at the UN. American exceptionalism, our robust vision of free speech.
I want to ask whether that exceptionalism, whether us being an outlier, means that we lose sight of the fact that free speech can exist in places that don't have the First Amendment. Right after this. We're talking about the president made a speech before the UN General Assembly defending the First Amendment, defending the principle of free speech as embodied in the First Amendment. And Akhil, you just made this really important point that I think because we don't spend a lot of time thinking comparatively in American politics particularly, lose sight of, which is that other liberal democracies have much more routine curtailments on speech than we have here as enjoyed in the First Amendment, but are not tyrannical dictatorships. I mean, it is compatible to have a liberal democracy that has free speech in principle, but has more curtailments. And I wonder if we, why should we have our system, I guess? I mean, why should we have this First Amendment that is so blanket, that allows so much, that allows for the kind of incitement that gets uploaded to YouTube? And
President Obama gave a couple of reasons. One that I kind of read into what he said. at least we should have it because it's ours and it's our tradition and has worked well for us. And he said, if you're skeptical of government, the folks that government are going to oppress first in the name of protecting against offense actually might be minorities of a certain sort. That blasphemy laws in America, have a very bad history. And if you are a little suspicious of government, which is part of our American DNA, and if you've had a tradition in which free speech has worked very robustly, look, where did we get the First Amendment? We got it from the exercise of free speech in that year. We marked the 225th anniversary this month, where we actually spoke. Right. The freedom of speech came in the text by the unwritten constitution of the practice. So our practice of free speech has been actually really a great one. And the abolitionists were offensive, and people tried to shut them down. And the civil rights movement, folks, people saying you're just stirring things up. Right. And so there's a history of government power suppressing.
And also, movements. I think it taps into a libertarian tendency that is real part of the American DNA, which is not necessarily politically liberal. I mean, free speech tends to be an argument that unites liberals and conservatives sometimes in surprising ways. I mean, remember, Citizens United.
Yes,
we started this morning talking about Citizens United.
This is a really important point.
About a conception of free speech that extends to corporations, that extends to spending money, concepts that are very foreign overseas and certainly very controversial within this country as well. But again, comes from the same idea that when it comes to speech, we don't want the government interfering at all.
Well, and it's interesting because the people that defend Citizens United, the decision is done in speech terms. Mitch McConnell and others on the right who are working to just essentially obliterate any kind of campaign finance reform, all of their arguments are made explicitly in speech terms, right? That is the argument they're using. And the question I have for you, Mona, is one of the things that's happened, you've been spending time in Egypt and spending time here. And I think there was a mass of people who were the core of the folks helping to bring down the Mubarak regime, right? A coalition of very diverse interests. I mean, you had people who were very devout, very Orthodox Muslims. You had essentially secular liberals. And then once the elections happened, I think there was this concern about whether people who are essentially secular liberals like yourself are going to have any purchase on the new Egypt, whether a vision of, say, fighting for something like a First Amendment or protected speech. Is there any constituency for that in Egypt? Or was this essentially a kind of small vanguard minority that now that the big boys are in charge, the Muslim Brotherhood has to pay no attention to?
No, they must pay attention to it because the Muslim Brotherhood understand, and I was on your show on the day that the election results were announced, the Muslim Brotherhood understands very well that their candidate only got 25% of a vote when he had to run against several candidates. So that's really their base support. What's happening in Egypt now is the kind of intense discussions that exactly led to your First Amendment. But my concern, the Egyptian side of me now, the American side of me loves the First Amendment, the right to free speech, the right to protest free speech, the right to freedom of worship. The Egyptian side of me questions again and again, and I've said this every time I've been on your show, why the U.S. administration would support dictators, and I urge them not to support any move by the current president that would deny us the freedoms of the First Amendment here. I want those kind of freedoms. I want a Bill of Rights that protects the minorities in Egypt in the way that minorities here exactly should not be attacked by a blasphemy law.
But this is where the rubber hits the road, right? This is exactly where the rubber hits the road, because you're sitting in the White House and you're trying to negotiate this incredibly difficult, incredibly unmapped relationship with the new elected leader of the largest Arab country in the world, in Egypt, right? Mohamed Morsi. And he says, hey, we're going to have a blasphemy law. And what are you going to say? Hey, it's your country. Do you want to sever or imperil that relationship over something like that? I mean, the same argument of sort of Western imperialism seems like it could apply there if they condemn it.
How about just saying, why don't you listen to the cause of your people for freedom and dignity, because that's what they wanted, and the goals of the revolution, which were bred liberty and social justice. But one last point. Mohamed Morsi, who right now in Egypt we have at least two young men. One of them is an atheist and one of them is a Christian from the Coptic community in Egypt, who is standing trial for blasphemy, atheism, offending Islam and offending the president. This same president, Mohamed Morsi, actually says, I've instructed the consulate in New York to look into Mona El-Tahawi's case because it's very important. So my freedom of speech in the US is very important for my president. But back in Egypt, these two young men's freedom of speech are being violated.
And they're being tried by the current government.
By the current government.
But the problem is what happens when the people in the Muslim world want the oppression of women, want stuff that is so offensive to us.
Who says they want it, Jeffrey?
The
people out on the streets demonstrating outside the U.S. Embassy were 200 people out of a community of a population.
No, but here's the question.
But
it seems plausible to me. Let's forget about oppression of women. It seems plausible to me that something like a blasphemy law could, if you put it to a referendum in Egypt, could pass. Right? That's not implausible, is it?
Let's see what blasphemy laws have done in Pakistan, whether they were put to a poll or not. They have just been used, and people recognize this, to target minorities and political opponents. So, we've got to get beyond this idea that the majority of people support the suppression of people's rights. That's not what it's about. Is this what America's about?
Right.
You have a Bill of Rights that opposes the tyranny of the majority, correct?
Yes, exactly.
I don't want the majority, whether it really is the majority or not.
That's the point.
That's the problem.
Right, that's the point. That there's majoritarian curtailments is part of erecting what,
and that's outrageous
democracy.
to say that the majority of people don't believe in women's rights or Christian rights in Egypt. I would say,
they don't,
you know
really?
what? No.
I don't know. I'm
outrageous.
asking as a question.
I don't even want to know. I want what I want to put in the law. What I want to put in the law is that everyone's right is guaranteed.
You don't want to know.
That
in some ways is the principle of something like the First Amendment. What you should know for the Newsweek ahead, coming up next. So what should you know for the week coming up? You should know that Pennsylvania Judge Robert Simpson has until this Tuesday to decide whether to block implementation of the new Republican law requiring citizens to show photo IDs before they vote. You should know that the standard Simpson has been ordered to apply by the state Supreme Court is whether the state has, in fact, made it both free and easy for citizens to get such IDs. That at a hearing on Thursday, citizens testified they had, in fact, not been able to get their IDs freely and easily. And you should know that A, that the people disproportionately disenfranchised by these Republican laws are disproportionately Democratic, and that B, the voter fraud these laws ostensibly prevent does not exist in any significant way. You should know that campaigning in Ohio this week, Mitt Romney held a roundtable on the economy, listening to local business owners, presidents, and treasurers. Romney spokesman Rich Gorka told the Washington Post the campaign did not invite workers or even middle managers because they're not the ones who have to make payroll or hiring decisions. You may already know that Romney's biggest claim to leadership is the office supply company Staples, but you should also know that Romney originally passed on investing in Staples after getting badly misstated estimates of how much money is spent on office supplies from business accountants, lawyers, and others. You should know that when you vote 6 weeks from now, that some politicians asking for your vote consider this a transactional exchange. If you want to be able to even just to contact the person who's supposed to represent everyone in their district, some of them want you to give them money first. One of those Republicans is Congressman Todd Akin, now running against incumbent Missouri Senator Claire McCaskill. Here's his recommendation for how constituents can reach him.
What is the best way to get in touch with the congressman? It sounds a little self-serving to say it, but you go out and somebody is working on a campaign and you find out that you like them, you think they're a good person, you go help them in their campaign, that gets their attention. And I've gone to people and asked for their support, their help, or their endorsement. And, some people say yes, you write me a decent check, and I remember that.
You write me a decent check? Oh, I remember that. Fact check, correct. They do remember that. Finally, you should know the first presidential debate of 2012 is this Wednesday night. I hope you'll watch me and the rest of the MSNBC team as we bring you special coverage of the debate, anchored by Rachel Maddow, starting at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. But you should also know that for what appears to be the first time, the Republican and Democratic parties' Commission on Presidential Debates has told the candidates ahead of time what the topics will be, including the economy, healthcare, and the role of government, but is refusing to tell the public the terms of the debate as negotiated by the two campaigns in secret. You should know that no matter how polarized elections are, some things both parties will always agree on. Barbara Arnwine from the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law is back with us at the table. I want to find out what my guests think you should know this week. Jeffrey Toobin, you're up first.
Every state that has voted on same-sex marriage, had referendums, has voted it down so far. This year, 4 states will have slightly different, but all essentially referendum on same-sex marriage. Washington State, Maryland, Minnesota, and Maine. And all of them, according to the polls, could actually pass same-sex marriage, which may have a bigger impact on the debate than any court decision.
And we didn't get to it today, but there's the very likelihood of the Defense of Marriage Act coming before the Supreme Court. It's already been struck down by an appellate court in Boston as unconstitutional. We may also get Proposition 8, which has been struck down in California, coming before the Supreme Court as well. So we have possibility of huge gay marriage judicial issues as well.
Indeed.
Barbara.
Yes, the Lawyers Committee and the Election Protection Coalition wants to make sure that voters know that they need to register to vote, and that voter registration deadlines are going to start closing in at least 10 states on October the 6th. And then the 7th, 8th, 9th, all the way through October 16th. So people need to get serious right now and make sure that you're registered to vote. If you have any questions, call the Election Protection Hotline. That's 1-866-687-8683.
We will put that up on our website.
Thank you.
Akhil Amar.
What you should know is that maybe the conventional wisdom that no one ever pays any attention to the bottom of the presidential ticket is a little overstated. This week, we saw some interesting evidence. It was actually featured on your show yesterday that seniors are beginning to move dramatically toward Obama. It's a possibility that this is because of Ryan in a whole bunch of ways. Obama has never been able to close the deal with seniors. Maybe he looks like a whippersnapper to them compared to John McCain or Mitt Romney. But now, with Ryan, who's even younger and maybe doesn't understand the concerns of elder Americans more, we're seeing sort of movement. And if so, I think maybe since 1992, actually, the party, if Obama were to go on to win, since 92, the party with the more sober and serious vice presidential candidate actually will have maybe prevailed.
Very interesting. Mona Eltahawy.
Well, October is Breast Cancer Awareness Month, and seeing as I've become associated with Pink now, I encourage everyone watching to self-examine and get mammograms. And also, seeing as I've somehow been associated with the rabidly anti-Muslim right-wing New York Post, I plan on calling them up and saying, will you come outside, come to a subway station with me where I will take off my blouse and bare-breasted demonstration in support of Breast Cancer Awareness Month and in support of my tattoo with a bare-breasted Egyptian goddess.
New York Post, I hope you're watching. We're huge as New York Post reporters. I want to thank my guest today, Jeffrey Toobin, author of The Oath, the Obama White House, and the Supreme Court. You want to definitely pick that up. Barbara Arnwine from the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under the Law. Yale Law professor Akhil Amar and Egyptian-American journalist Mona Eltahawy. Thank you all. It was a really great conversation. Thank you for joining us. We'll be back next weekend, Saturday and Sunday at 8 Eastern Time. Our guests will include Joseph Stiglitz, professor of economics at Columbia University, Nobel laureate, and author of the book The Price of Inequality. Coming up next is, of course, Melissa Harris Perry. On today's MHP Debate Club Preview Edition, Melissa's 10-year-old daughter, Parker, will make a very special appearance you will not want to miss. That's Melissa Harris Perry coming up next. Don't forget MSNBC's coverage of the first 2012 presidential debate this Wednesday, starting with this special edition of Hardball live from the site of the debate, Denver, Colorado at 5 Eastern, continuing at 8 Eastern with MSNBC's team coverage, led by Rachel Maddow along with Chris Matthews, the Reverend Al Sharpton, Ed Schultz, Lawrence O'Donnell, Steve Schmidt, and yours truly. We'll see you next weekend with our own coverage of the debate. You don't want to miss that right here on Up.